So I'm Phil Mirvis. I'm living in Taos, New Mexico, and I'm joined by my colleagues Sue Mohrman and Chris Worley to talk about how to do relevant research. So the theme of this first session, and there'll be 3 of them over the next several weeks, is kind of the basics of the battle between theory and practice, the irresistible force and the immovable object. And those of you who are new to the field may not realize that this has been an ongoing battle for 50 to 100 years, depending on how you're counting, of what is the purpose of our research? How do we do it? Who's it intended for? And so on. And the 3 of us have had a career that has tried to sort of navigate the space between these 2 interests, theory and practice, that we will call in our new book, How to Do Relevant Research, which this 3-part series sort of introduces you to, is called the sweet spot. It's an ideal location, level, area, or combination of factors for a particular activity and purpose. And our work today will be to sort of delve into this sweet spot by talking a little bit, first of all, about who we are and how we got into this space between theory and practice in our research, starting in our graduate student days and maybe even before. Chris is going to talk then about the big ideas in the book, and there are a couple of them. I'll let him explain it to you, and we'll talk a little bit about how the book was created, because it was partly our thinking, but it was also talking to colleagues and peers and characters we knew around the world who do this kind of work as well. And then we'll have 2 more detailed, kind of deeper dive examples. Sue's going to talk about programmatic research that she's conducted at the Research Center at the University of Southern California. And Chris is going to dive into a particular study on agility research. And then we'll open it up to Yak Yak. With all present questions, comments, reflections, and so on, and close with the preview of the next 2 sessions and where we are. So that sound reasonable? Seeing no one nodding their head, I'll proceed and let's get the party started. So this is me, not physically, but symbolically. We're back in the late 1960s. And I was a student in college trying to decide what I was going to be, quote unquote, when I graduated. And what caught my attention on this slide here was a big strike at a factory in Lordstown, Ohio. This was built by General Motors, called the Factory of the Future. It was created to more or less idiot-proof the assembly line process. Every job had a 30-second cycle time. So you would go bzz, 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 bzz for 30 seconds, pause, rest for 10, and start again. That was your day. And the workers went on strike. And they weren't striking about wages. They were comparatively well paid. They weren't striking about other matters. They were striking because these jobs are for blank, blank idiots, as one of the factory workers described it. 60 Minutes came out, this new television program with news of the world, to interview the factory workers. And they said, one of them, well, you know, your attendance record shows you're only here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. You're never here Friday. Why are you never here Friday? And he says to the reporter, Mike Wallace, Mr. Wallace, I don't make enough money to come to work 3 days a week. So that's where we were. So I got excited about this, which was the 60s era and protests over this and that. And I decided that my job was going to be to save the worker. And as I was thinking about how to do this, I saw a report issued by actually a colleague of ours from USC on work in America, Jim O'Toole. And this was a study of what work is like in America and how we've created the blue collar blues. And they were showing up in the white collar woes and disaffection among the workforce and so on. And suddenly I put 2 and 2 together and I said, my goodness, we got a problem. And research, data gathering, thinking, analysis, and ideas could be part of how to tackle this problem. So that's geared me toward doing relevant and practical research. About that same time, I got in touch with someone who's influenced all three of us, Ed Lawler, who was a professor at the University of Michigan. He said, well, you might be interested in Michigan, come up here. So I did my graduate work in the psychology department at Michigan. I learned how to do quantitative survey-based research. I got it's my first exposure to action research. And as I went along, I went into the Detroit Art Gallery and came across this mural from Diego Rivera. It presents conditions of work in the factory. And I was stunned. I said, this is telling me some things that my survey research is not telling me. This is evoking some feelings in me that motivate me to action in a different way than action research. So that as my career unfolded, I yes do quantitative research, yes do action research, yes do qualitative research, but also got interested in aesthetics and what a more artful way of doing research and expressing your research and communications was all about. So that's my entry story. Let me turn to our next presenter, Sue. I think. Oop.
Okay. No, go back a couple.
There we go. Okay,
yeah.
Sue.
Okay. Thanks, Phil. And I have a story that began around the same time, which is the late 1960s, when I graduated college and began as a public school teacher in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it was right after our last huge wave of race riots in the United States. The 1960s, the civil rights movement, and then riots around the war in Vietnam, and it was almost a period that felt exactly like today's period feels. And I was in an inner city school teaching junior high school kids, and realized that I was in an institution that didn't fit the work that was being done. Everybody was brought into a room for 50 minutes, and then they'd taken to another room for 50 minutes. And most of the kids that were there hadn't done the homework, didn't bring the books, and didn't have pens, and those kinds of things. And the teachers never talked to each other. And at the end of the year, we had what we felt was a very suboptimal productivity. And it got me very interested in how do you actually set up schools, or how do you, to Phil's point, even set up organizations. And I was concerned not as much for the teachers, although I should have been, but I was really concerned for these students who left after a year where there might as well have been COVID keeping them at home, because that was about how much work some of them put in the building. And that was when I made a decision to go back to graduate school and learn how you actually design and set up organizations. I thought that was what I was doing. And so I went to Northwestern University, where I had the really good fortune to study under Bob Duncan, who had studied under and with Ed Lawler and with Chris Argyris and others in the field of OD, as well as Bob was an organization theorist who did very rigorous structural research. And he combined the two, and he combined the two for his students. So I was really lucky to be in a situation where I was exposed to both the rigor and the relevance of research. My dissertation was in a public school district in Wisconsin, and it was around what a participative process to get teachers to talk about how to better organize to teach kids. And it was a 2-year process, and got 2 years longitudinal data, and learned a heck of a lot about the issues that are involved in that kind of institution. Used a lot of, you'll see the book on the left is Employee Involvement in America, which is a sort of a summary follow-on to the work that Ed Lawler had been doing, that Phil was part of at the University of Michigan, really looking at how to get people who are working centrally involved in deciding how to do their work best, and how to interact with one another, and to team with another, and collaborate. That became the foundation for a research center that Ed Lawler left Michigan, came to USC, and set up called the Center for Effective Organizations, whose explicit mission is to combine the rigor of theory and systematic research with relevance to organizations. And it built on that combined learning about organization development and change and group process and teaming and collaboration, and the problems of that companies and organizations were actually facing, and the rigorous knowledge that had been created that could be potentially applied and furthered in the course of working with companies. So on the left side, a major point I want to make is that on the left side of my slide are topical issues, things like how do you do change? How do you get employees involved? How do you design team-based organizations? And then more recently, I skipped a few topic areas that our society has gone through, or how do you organize for sustainability? What do you actually have to do differently about the way you set up your organization? And then if you want to be a corporate steward, a company wants to actually address the societal and contextual issues as well as the performance issues of their organization. How do you actually organize in order to do that? And those were all content issues that I've been lucky enough to be parts of teams that have looked at those. And then on the right is a series of books. It started with the pink one, doing research useful for theory and practice, which you'll see Ed Lawler is the first author, but then there's a bunch of us who worked on that. We always started with these kinds of books with a conference, brought together people who we thought were doing that kind of research, tried to learn from each other, and then put it in this book that everyone contributed to. That book actually had 3 different manifestations. One was in 1985 when that book, the first one, came out. The one on the right was an invited book actually by a publisher, and we updated the doing useful research with lots of new cases and new authors. And then in 2010 we did the book Useful Research: Advancing Theory and Practice, which brought even more kinds of cases, more cases that looked at sort of the complex societal issues that we were dealing with, and researchers who were doing work that was making a difference and being able to address those. And all along, we were, as a CEO, and I in particular was interested in collaborative management research, and had the fortune of being a colleague of Rami Shani's and Bill Passmore and several European researchers who were looking at the same kinds of issues. And we had about 6 institutions came together to create this collaborative management research book. So just sort of a bottom line of all this is that it's a journey through society and through the history of the issues that organizations are dealing with, and they change, and we have to change too. And that is sort of what do you actually want to study and learn. And then on the right hand side is it's not what you often learn in graduate school. It's something that you really have to think about. How do you do research that can be used and is used in organizations? And we don't have it right yet. With each book, we were hopeful that maybe these kinds of ways of doing work were going to catch on a little bit more. I think there's been a slow journey for academia getting to the point where they're starting to say we really need to do responsible research, as our MB is set up to do, to foster, and we have to do research in a different way. That's what we try to really talk about in our book. And in doing the book, we have highlighted something which Phil has referenced, but I want to reiterate, which is people have been doing this all along. People like Ed Lawler, people like Richard Hackman when he was still alive, and a whole number of people that we highlight in our book have been doing this, but it's been drowned out by a prevailing positivistic, quantitative, theory-based, theory-promoting research, rather than a combination of a rigor and relevance. And the second thing is that where you do this and with whom you do it really makes a difference, because there is a broad set of people that we have relied on to be able to do research that cuts between practice and theory. And we have colleagues from that whole spectrum, all the way from hardcore practitioners to very specialized and detailed, rigorous researchers in a number of different fields. So that's kind of what we try to cover in the book. And it sort of reflects what I feel I have learned slowly and with a great deal of difficulty and hard work in my career.
So
On to Chris.
Yeah. All right, Phil, you're going to let me share? All right, can everybody see that now? All right, let's see, I'm having trouble seeing everybody. Okay. For my part, if I can get to here, my sort of introduction to what I'm doing. I came at this stuff from a very different sort of perspective. Even as an undergrad, I had a National Science Foundation grant to study how a change was going to happen in a reservoir in Utah, how that was going to change the economics and the psychology and the recreation and the biology of an area. I was an environmentalist, and this student originated studies project that we did in central Utah just fascinated me. I was just absolutely curious about the relationship that humans had with their environment. And I went from that undergraduate experience to Colorado State, where I have a master's degree in outdoor recreation. That was my first master's degree. And this is a picture of me on my horse when I was working for the Forest Service. And Vanilla, my horse, and I had spent 2 summers trying to understand the question, why do people destroy the things they love? Why would people come to the outdoors, to a forest, to a national park, and overuse it, pollute it, deface it? Why would we go to places that are so beautiful and things that we love, and then kind of do things that worked against them? And as I looked at that problem, I got into economics. It was a great classic book by Clausen and Knecht on the economics of outdoor recreation and willingness to pay, and a whole set of issues in the social science that were just fascinating to me. And I was working for the Forest Service. I was trying to do research in wilderness areas and other kinds of recreational spots, trying to understand why people were doing silly things to the environment and destroying it at the same time they were trying to enjoy it. And the whole notion of sort of inquiring into why people do things the way they do was a fascinating sort of question for me. It was in the Forest Service, when I was working for the Forest Service, that I got introduced to this whole idea of organization development. And the book covers there in the center are several covers from the original Addison Wesley series in organization development. And I just became fascinated with this whole notion of, how do we change things? Because in the Forest Service and in the Central Utah project at Strawberry Reservoir, we were, it wasn't just a matter of trying to understand the system. I wanted to make the system do better things, produce better results across not just individual outcomes, but social and economic and environmental outcomes. And this whole field of organization development seemed very interesting to me, because they were sitting around trying to figure out how to intervene in systems to make them better. And so I went and got a second master's degree at Pepperdine in their MSOD degree. And at the time, OD was very focused on interpersonal group dynamics, kinds of changes, quality of work life, and that sort of thing. And it seemed to me that that was, especially in the context of the stuff that I was doing at the Forest Service, that seemed very micro to me. And I knew there was these other bigger issues going on, up above. And so in a ironic way, I went back to get my doctorate so I could become relevant. And I started at USC. And as part of my doctoral program at USC, I bumped into this set of characters over at the Center for Effective Organizations. And so I've got, I've been connected with the center in a lot of different ways, formally and informally over the years, and watched it, change its logo several times. But as a doctoral student, I started getting a chance to work with Sue and her husband, Monty, and Ed Lawler and Jerry Ledford. And again, that cast of characters at the center, and this one large scale project that we did, looking at what was happening to General Telephone and Electric post deregulation, when they busted up AT&T and GTE had to sort of figure out. And so we looked at just a whole range of things. We were looking at technology adoption. We were looking at reorganization. We were looking at labor management relationships. And it was just this big, massive sort of research effort where we were both interested in, trying to understand what was going on in the system and how might we be able as both consultants and researchers to engage with that organization and make some change. And so that just kicked things off for me. I was in a larger system. I was trying to understand, with the background in the micro stuff and the group dynamics and the interpersonal relationships, and then getting my degree in strategy and economics at the business school at USC and working in the center. It opened up this whole world for me of trying to understand how does this whole notion of changing things and intervening connect with and integrate with ideas around strategy. So that has been the research question that has driven everything that I've done. And I'll a little later here this morning, or at least morning for my time, it's now starting to get light out here, talk about at least one of these arcs of research that has kept me busy for a while. So that's me. That's the three of us. And what I'd like to do now is sort of shift from kind of our backgrounds and our interests. So you can see the weaving. It's going to be interesting. Jim O'Toole's going to come up in one of my stories as well, and begin to talk about what we were doing in the book and the models that we used to explain this notion of how to do the work. And I think for us, as we were writing the book, it started with sort of identifying these three questions that people need to sort through. Sue talked about how it was important to do who you do this work with. I think another theme, one of the other themes in the book is, are you clear about what you are trying to do and your own sort of orientation to this work? And so these questions sort of, became the foundation of the work that we did in the book. And the first one sort of asks, where do you get your research questions from? In a traditional positivistic epistemology, you go after theory and you say, where are those gaps and what needs to be filled, and are the assumptions right? And you take a problematic approach or a critical approach, and you start to unpack theory and say, how do I develop that more? Or you could sort of lean on the other way and say, there's a lot of interesting things going on inside organizations. And these people are trying to figure stuff out in real time. And it's not just one organization, it's a bunch of organizations that are dealing with these issues at the same time. And I wonder if there's some research there that we could do that would help them. So you have this choice about where you go. The second choice that you have is, how will you do your research? Excuse me. How will you do that research? And in our research methods courses, we're taught about, Latin squares and research designs and multivariate analysis of variance and structural equation models and the data you need and the reliability and the validity of all that. And that's all good stuff. All three of us were steeped in that kind of training. And on the other hand, managers and practitioners don't really want to know much about that. What they want to know is the way you're doing this research credible? And so we thought that it was kind of interesting, because both practitioners and academics want both rigorous and relevant methods. They just define it differently. So we have to think about how we're going to do the work. And then lastly, kind of linking into Phil's notion of aesthetics, we have to answer the question, how are we going to communicate this? Excuse me, it's still morning for me. I gotta get going. How are we going to communicate this work? To whom? How will we write and present and describe and depict our research? And speaking to the different channels of research that get out to practitioners versus the different channels of communication that get out to the academic and scholarly community. How are we thinking about the process of moving those research and those findings out into the world? Those became the three questions. And as we thought about that, we recognized that there were some patterns in the way people displayed and went about their work. In the traditional, on the left side here, on the traditional way, you were, and as I suspect many of us are trained, source your research questions in theory. What is it that we need to learn? What don't we know yet? Where is theory? Where are the strengths and the weaknesses of the theory? What are alternative points of view and different assumptions that we can apply to theory? Let's make sure that we collect data and do the theoretical work in a really rigorous way so that we are clear about how knowledge progresses. And let's be really sure that we get into the A journals and begin to establish our reputation as scholars and respected as scholars, because we're contributing to the body of knowledge that is generated in this traditional positivistic epistemology. And on the other hand, I think we all know and recognize there's a bunch of people who look out at the world and see phenomena that are going on across organizations, across societies, across nations, and are curious about, why do these problems persist? Or how can we help the people figure out better how to solve those challenges, take advantage of those opportunities? To do that, we have to go in and collect data and do the research in a way that's credible and relevant and be seen by practitioners and managers as being really, really connected to their problems, and then being able to communicate what we find in terms of our patterns, looking across different organizations or groups or processes, and be able to come back and say, here's the patterns that we see, and here's some ideas or suggestions about how we might address those. So it was pretty clear that these two predominant sort of patterns existed out there. And we said, okay, part of our job now is to think about that sweet spot that Phil described at the beginning. And this became kind of one of the main models in the book. And the notion is, and what we tried to explain in the book is, how do I increase the size of that sweet spot so that at any particular time with any particular study, and then certainly over a program of research, how do I start thinking about, being clear about what's going on in theory and close enough to it so that I know kind of what's going on and what the current state of the art of our thinking is as scholars. And at the same time, bridging over and being close enough and connected to the world of practice that we can understand the problems and the challenges facing managers and executives and workers, right? How do we put a foot in both of those worlds and be connected to both of those worlds at the same time? How can we understand, leverage, respect, and use the traditional methods of research in terms of data and data gathering and statistical analysis and qualitative analysis, but also be aware of ways to connect to practice, pull data and information from practice, and do so in a way that is seen as relevant and credible by the practitioner world, and not just some egg-headed ivory tower data set that is, we sort of comb through. But how do we use data and pull data that seems to make sense to the practitioner as well? And then lastly, do we always choose to try and get our work into A journals, and that's the only thing that we spend our life doing? Or do we spend some time being sure that we're connected to that world and publishing in that world, as well as sharing and translating our research into the language of the practitioner, so that that information is getting out into the world? And so the whole notion of the sweet spot became, how do we sort of increase that big red dot in there and try and cover all these spaces? And again, I want to emphasize, we did in the book, is it's not that every study has to do that. One study might be a little more theory driven, one study might be a little more practitioner driven, or you could think about a particular study and you say, I really want to try and increase the size of the sweet spot around all these dimensions. Okay, so there's lots of ways to get there. We want to be sure that we respect, leverage, acknowledge that everybody's contributing to this. There's a place in the world for the theorist. There's some people who are really good at that, and we want them to be really good at that because they make a contribution. And at the same time, there's people who are doing really good practitioner research, consulting, generating research out in practice, and that's really helpful. And at the same time, if you're sitting over on that theory side, maybe you could be a little more practitioner oriented. And if you're practitioner, maybe you could be we're trying to figure out what's the right, best way to portray all of this so that the work and the knowledge we generate is credible, usable, relevant, and rigorous, all at the same time. Okay, so that's one model. Coming back to Sue's point about it's really important who you do this work with. This was a diagram that I think Sue started drawing back in those relevant research books that she did with the center. And this map is both a social network and a network of products and ideas. On the left-hand side is sort of our network of scholars, right? We all belong to a scholarly network, and most of us belong to universities. We may be parts of research centers or institutes, but our main core identifying place of work is the scholarly community. And we have a set of disciplines: finance, economics, psychology, anthropology, marketing, right? And we sort of get into and understand those issues, and we're trying to generate good scholarly knowledge. That's on the left side. Over on the right side are networks of practitioners, people who are talking to each other, trying to figure out how to get stuff done. And in between that is a set of translators. In between those two scholarly and practitioner worlds are a set of products that begin to translate scholarly knowledge into practical knowledge. There's consult at the top. We've got different venues for doing research in the consulting firms and the for-profit organizations, think tanks, and places where we can go get some research done. There's also, again, this translation. sometimes consultants and scholar practitioners take the work done in theory and begin to, translate it into the world of practitioners and put it in different sort of forms and shapes that can be used by and understood by practitioners. And so then we end up with these set of products here, kind of on the more on the right side of the thing. These often show up in our classrooms: textbooks, professional books, tools, speeches, cases. And again, these are very understandable to the practitioner community, because it sort of looks like this is what somebody's doing and how they're working on it. Here's the conditions, and we can use it as a translation mechanism. And so what the knowledge generating network does is it begins to operationalize the value stream in knowledge creation, where there is this sort of notion that from basic research into applied research and into practice, there is this feedback loop at the bottom that says practice is often a place where we go to learn about what's going on because the managers are solving problems in real time. And then we pull that back into the scholarly world, try and understand it, put it in context of our theories and frameworks, and then again, start to push it down from left to right so that it becomes part of it. So this becomes a really interesting graphic, because it asks the questions: where are you? Do you live only on the left side of the diagram? Or are you in the middle, in your social networks and the people that you talk to and work with? Are you way over on the right and you only talk to practitioners? How are you translating your work into different sort of products: theory-based products, knowledge-based products, practice-based products? And so there's a social network here, and there's a network here of products and services and outputs that give you a chance to position yourself in this world and give you a sense about what you need to do, where you need to go, who you need to talk to.
Chris, could I just make one comment? Just
yes, please.
One thing that you didn't point out, which we've had in this framework ever since the second version of doing relevant research, is that on that, what Chris describes as the scholarly side in the circle, organization practice knowledge is there, and it often is in the form of organization practitioners who become research partners in the process. It is not just people in academia or research institutes. It is also people who are in organizations who actually become part of the team. And the framework I'm going to share in a bit actually is centered around that premise.
Got it. Thanks, Sue. Yeah. So executive doctoral students becomes a really interesting notion for people from the world of practice, come back into the scholarly thing, begin to think about things, join up and do research with faculty members. Consultants often do that. When I get talking about mine, I'll talk about how I've related with some consulting firms in doing my research. So that very cool. Thanks, Sue. All right. Now, we're going to ask you some questions here in just a minute, but before we get there, we wanted to start, relate to where are you in this world, and why would this book might be of interest to you. You could be a doctoral student. In fact, I think as we began to do this book, one of the things that we heard a lot from our informal conversations, I don't want to portray it as anything but sort of an informal process, but it was a consistent one. And we kept talking to doctoral students and early assistant professor kinds of people who, and this is my word, they were in pain. They were in pain. They wanted to do stuff that was interesting and relevant and rigorous, but they kept getting messages from the surrounding environment. Build equity in your curriculum vitae first. get those A journal publications. When you get tenure, then you can think about maybe writing something for practice, but focus on your theory building. And so we wanted, and we recognized that in most research methods courses, you don't get this exposure to this kinds of stuff. And so we wanted to write a book that would expose people to this kind of stuff, and give them a chance to see that it is possible. And as Sue said, this is not like it's a new thing. We're trying to recognize what has been done in the past. To Sue's point about that scholar, that practitioner that comes into academia, there's a set of scholar practitioners. It's an interesting word. We asked the people in our interviews, do you call yourself a scholar practitioner, scholar, just a scholar? And you know, as a practitioner, you know, your practice knowledge, your practical knowledge may not be so respected inside the worlds and the halls of academia. And so you want to sort of figure out a way, how do I do this work and get it respected and understood, and bridge the gap between what I know in the real world and what is known in theory. And then the last sort of group that we thought we were writing for was, you know, the peripatetic professor who is just embedded in doing research and says, this stuff is important, and I'd like to find a way to get it out there, but I keep getting these sort of messages that HBR is not really the right way to get stuff out there, but still has an interest, right? Still recognizes and sees that the work that they're doing could be applied, and wants to think of a way to work from left to right on that diagram in the knowledge generating network. So those are kind of our audiences, and it brought, I think we're going to move to the thing.
To the poll now.
Poll, yeah.
Yeah, so Ebrod, can you bring up the first question?
So I need to stop sharing, I think. Oh, there it is. No.
There we go. Yeah.
Yep,
So
there
let's
it is.
get empirical here. I just saw Ben Schneider in the audience. He's one of those peripatetic professors. This is a poll. We'd like you to want to find out kind of where you are now. As you think about your own research, is it mostly driven by theoretical questions, mostly driven by practical questions, or somewhere in between, like in a continuum? So please fill in your poll as quickly as possible.
And there's 3 questions there, so you might have to scroll down in your box.
Well, we'll do the first one first.
Okay.
Okay, we got a nice normal curve here.
Got about half the respondents in.
Okay, well, that's a pretty good picture of our audience. And you know, you're the group we're speaking to, if you will, those whose own research is driven by theoretical, practical questions. This blending, the sweet spot. Let's jump to question number 2, Ebrod.
Phil, these are all 3 questions.
Oh,
I think people are answering them all at once.
You just can scroll, Chris.
scroll down. Okay. Now, so
Well, we'll end the poll. We'll end the poll here.
And the poll. We got them all done.
You'll be happier this way, I think.
Okay, I see what you're doing now. Okay, so we see the nice normal curve on question number 1 that we talked about. Yep. Question number 2, you see that for the home institutions of many of us, it veers very much toward that theory side of the spider web, if you will. This is what's valued in our home institution. And, you know, particularly for a young professor or a graduate student, those are the socializing messages. This is what you're supposed to do. question 2.
And question 2.
And this is where the pain comes from.
Right.
And here's the purpose of the book. We see a lot of people are not at all prepared, no training or experience, a little bit of training experience, some training experience, but it's not as though it's a group that is, this is what we do in our lives, and we're going to train and orient you toward that. It's not a medical school model we've been participating in or an engineering school model. It's an academic model based on theory. And our hope with the book is twofold. One is that you as an individual will get some ideas and perspectives to become more skillful in this arena. And secondly, that the institutional setting in preparation of a graduate student, the ongoing development of a scholar will emphasize how to get into knowledge networks, how to work with managers as co-researchers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we will report those findings. Now, how do we? To go ahead and get rid of the poll there, hey, Brent.
Okay. All right, so you're going to share, Phil?
Yeah, I still have those slides in front of me. I think you may have to do this, Chris.
Okay.
I can't get my poll off.
Okay.
Oh, you do the X at the top.
Yeah, I asked it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so just a final comment on this. Just as we polled you, we actually took a pretty good dive to a group of scholars in preparing the book. It's really 3 sources. One is our own personal experiences, and we started that with the autobiography, and we share throughout the book our studies. Secondly, we talked to a number of people who we respected, who had been successful at bridging theory and practice gap. Finally, we looked at the literature. And if you see in the next slide, you can see some of the folks we talked to. You'll recognize in there Jean Bartunik, for example, who was a great influence on us over a career. She presented at one of the first seminars in this series, and Sandra Waddick. We talked to Max Bazerman, Michael Porter, of course, our influence, Ed Lawler. Got an interview with my wife, Mary Jo Hatch, and her research partner, Mike and Schultz. David Zuga and the African Association with Management socialized ideas and exchanged perspectives with them. Adam Grant, kind of a young star rising up in Andy Vandeven, a senior star, to get their perspectives entering academe in different time. And of course, Ensui and the folks up the Network of Business Sustainability and so on. And we want to say to you that if you're interested in this kind of work, one, there's a lot of great mentors out there. And these are just a fraction of them. Secondly, they're an example of how you can work in this liminal world between academe and practice and have a successful scholarly career. And third, you got a lot of partners and friends that will support you in these efforts. So let's go to Sue's next, Chris. And Sue, you want to tell your story?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, in the book, we do cover this kind of flow, which is a flow that we worked out early on in the history of the Center for Effective Organizations to do what we promised, which was to do research in a collaborative method. And you can see from the graphic that that means for us that there's a continual cycle of researchers learning from practice and practitioners learning from research. It also means for us that there's a way of doing research that systematically brings in both the theoretical underpinnings as well as the perspective of practice. And the reason this is so important is I mentioned earlier on that my dissertation research had been in a school system in Waukegan, Illinois. And literally between Bob Duncan and Jerry Zaltman and others who were on the team with me and several other graduate students, we really honed the research and had a beautiful, in my view, I was a graduate student, what did I know? But in my view, it was a beautiful theoretical perspective and had a lot of experience in the room in the form of Bob and Jerry and turning that into interventions into the system. And it was 2 years, as I said, and at the end of it, really nothing was, they thanked us very much and they said they'd learned so much and nothing changed. And in fact, my very first professional publication was in a book edited by Phil Mirvis about failures in OD, because nobody wanted to write about failures in OD. And we wrote this up as a failure. I don't know if it really was a failure, but the name of it was the light at the end of the tunnel is really a train coming the other way straight at you. And in retrospect, we should have known that nothing was going to change, because we had practitioners who were recipients of stuff that we were doing. They weren't partners in the process. You know, they came and enjoyed sessions where they talked about what bothered them most and what they could do differently, but they weren't partners in a process of trying to really change the way the organization functioned. And what we'd like to do, and what we tried to set up CEO to do, is really get that partnership in place. And it had to start with us with getting a really good qualitative understanding of the phenomena. Now, having been a public school teacher, I thought I really understood that, but somehow it got translated into theoretical perspectives that didn't quite hit the reality of coming to school and having in your first period 3/4 of the kids so tired because they've been up all night that they can't even listen, and most of them have their heads on the desk. It didn't really hit at those kinds of realities. So this first learning is you really need to understand the phenomena that you're looking at, and you have to really review the existing literature. So there's the two inputs. What is this phenomena as it appears, and what is the literature that might help with this? And then what we always did was have what we called an interest group, where we'd have companies that were interested in learning about this particular area, whatever it was, and we would share some frameworks with them, just sort of test frameworks to see whether it connected with them and to see what they would add to it and how they would change it and where there were gaps that they really needed to learn about. And then we would go back into the field, into their companies, and do really systematic, qualitative, grounded research with both observations and interviews, and very systematic coding process to see, you know, really when you gathered the data, what was seemed to be going on. And then we would go back and we would revise the theoretical framework. And by then, we almost always had a couple of practitioners who were happy to go through that process with us, because they'd really become engaged in the content of the research. And they would sit down and spend a day, or in some cases, several days with us, really saying, you know, what should we really be looking at here? And then we would take the results of the qualitative research, put it into frameworks, and then turn it into instruments where we could do a quantitative test. We called it our 10 company studies, where we do a quantitative test of the theoretical framework across diverse companies, and look at the results both across companies and within companies to see why there was variation, as well as what the overall patterns were. And all the time getting practitioners to help us interpret what those results were. Oh, well, you want to know why that particular part of the company was scored high on this and low on that, and there was no relationship. It's because of the nature of the work they did. Duh. You know, it's like those kinds of things that they could look right away and understand the patterns in our data much better than we could. And then we would find, now there were a couple of companies that really wanted to try new things, and we would shift to an action research mode and really look what happened when they would make changes, based on what they learned through their studies. When they would implement a new way of helping people who were trying to work, let's say in teams cross-functionally, to learn enough about other functions to work effectively with them. That was one of the action research projects that came out of our team studies. And then all the time disseminating to different stakeholders, early findings at professional meetings, both practitioner-oriented as well as academy management and EGOS and other academic conferences, where our colleagues in academia were very happy also to tell us the holes in our framework, and then conduct follow-on investigations. We evolved into new areas to study and to enrich actionable understanding. I remember, based on our team studies, which is about a 3-year process of going through this set of steps, the companies were actually almost, they're proactively saying, we need a study that shows, if we're going to do cross-functional teaming, how you can get people to think about the system and not just about their part of the system. So that was our next study. Again, started with qualitative, started with really getting practitioners involved, went into the field and did a lot of interviews with different kinds of teams, came up with a framework, instrumented that into a quantifiable study, collected data from 10 companies, shared it with all of them, got them to help us to interpret the data, and got them to talk about the unsolved problems in the realm of teaming, and started the collaborative cycle all over again. So it's just sort of a rhythm that we developed, and people would join for different parts of the study. Usually one of us would, or several of us would stay with the whole I think our team study was 8 years in total, with 3 different sub-studies. And there were 3 of us that stayed with that the whole time. And the rest were graduate students coming in and out, or other colleagues who were particularly relevant to the issue, let's say of cross-functionality, who joined us for that study. And we just built our network of collaboration through that whole process. That just is a picture of a way to think about doing research as not just one study, but a series of studies where you learn from practice and practice learns from you. So, Chris,
Great.
you have an example. You have an example.
I'm going to try and take this set of stuff, right? These ideas and this flow. Somebody commented in the chat, Sue, that he really loved this slide because it told him he was on the right track.
Oh, good.
So
you can be in our next book.
That's right. And if I'm reading his story right, he sort of got in. He wanted to come back to academia because he was frustrated in practice, and he was trying to understand. So he came back, and his term, apparently his Mexican professor calls him a pracademic. So he really thought this was a great slide because it sort of confirmed for him that the work that he was doing and the way he was doing it was sort of right. So very cool. So what I wanted to do, sorry, this is a very, very busy slide, but I think it's a way of bringing that process that Sue just talked about alive in a specific case. And to help you understand how this is sort of laid out, I tried to lay out all these icons and stuff according to the knowledge generating network. All right, so over on the left, you've got kind of that scholar community that I'm a part of on the one hand, and over on the right, you've got some companies that were very much a part of the Center for Effective Organization. Some of them are sponsors at the center. Some of them are just organizations that I found a way to get involved with. But what I want to do here is tell that story. Tell a story of an arc of a research process. And I've been doing this. I've been studying agility now for 15 years, 16 years. And it sort of started, I'm going to start kind of in the middle with the book Built to Change. Ed Lawler had just finished a book that he thought was really important. It was about treat people right, and he thought that was an important book, and he was really frustrated because it wasn't selling, it wasn't getting any traction with people, and he thought he had some interesting things to say, and so he was kind of grousing about for what he wanted to do next. And some people that he talked with said, well, you haven't written much about change lately. And one of the people he talked to was Tom Cummings. I was kind of doing the same thing. I was sort of trying to figure out, what do I need to do next? I've got this strategy, org design, change thing I need to sort of figure out. And so I was talking to Tom Cummings because Tom and I write the OD text. And Tom was like, God, this is just so stupid. The two of you need to talk. And so Built to Change became a book that, represented kind of the interests that Ed and I had at the time, and we were trying to figure out where to go. And about that time, I joined the center. I returned to the scene of the crime, as it were, after having been a doctoral student there. And this is where it's interesting, Phil, you raised the thing with the Work in America project. Here's Jim O'Toole again. And Jim O'Toole is an interesting character, right? And one of the, because of that study, because it was a national study and it was really well known in the time, Jim has this amazing network. And one of the people that he knows was Tom Williams, which is over in the lower right-hand corner. And Tom was a partner within Booz Allen Hamilton. And the center had done some work with Booz before. And Tom, sort of knew who we were. And Jim said, well, Chris and Ed are doing this thing. Maybe we should hook up and do some research on this change stuff that is, a new idea, built to change, agility, whatever you wanted to call it. And I put Tom's picture there because over the course of the arc of this research, Tom worked for Booz Allen Hamilton. Booz Allen Hamilton split, became Strategy and. Eventually Strategy and got bought by PwC. So during the arc of this process, Tom's role changed, and his employer changed through acquisitions and splits and things like that. And that's part of the context of doing this work. I've got my scholarly community at CEO and at USC. I was also part of the MSOD program at Pepperdine University. Over time, I did a stint in France and lived in France for 4 years and 5 out of 6 years at the Neoma Business School. And so I got a set of people that I talk to and work with and play with, thinking about, disciplinary issues and strategy and org design, org theory and change. And that becomes a rich part of the conversation that I have. But I've always sort of interested in practice, and Built to Change was sort of a book where we said, is it possible, given what we know about organizations, to recognize that most of our organization models are built on stability? Is it possible that we could design an organization built on change, hence the name? And we started putting together what we knew about organization design and strategy and change, and came up with some prototype ideas for what that could be. And the next question became, can we actually show that in the data? Are there organizations that are leveraging some of these principles to design an organization that changes sort of more or less routinely and repeatedly? And it was through that research, now I link back over to the right side, and I start to talk to different organizations. You'll see organizations there in North America, you'll see European organizations. The reach and the breadth of the center was pretty impressive, and allowed me and gave me access to a lot of organizations. My own network, Sue's network, Phil's network, exposed me to different companies who were said, yeah, we kind of would be interested. How well do we stack up to this notion of an agile organization, and how would we define it? And what's your assessment of our organization? Where are we strong and where are we weak with respect to some of these principles that you started to work with? So we went out into the field and we started talking to people, interviews, surveys. We analyzed performance data to really ground the notion of agility in performance. A lot of agility definitions don't talk about the relationship it has with performance. And so we started getting involved with organizations. And I just listed a few here. Again, tried to represent the breadth of the companies that we ended up working with. And through that research, one formal statement of that work came in the Agility Factor book, where Ed and Tom and I sort of pulled all that data together and started talking about organizations, not just new organizations. Surprisingly, there's some really old organizations that have figured out how to design themselves in a way that allows them to adjust. And it's normal. They don't see change as kind of this odd thing that they have to do every once in a while and rip the Band-Aid off. And that these principles could be linked very clearly to principles of strategy and organization design and change. And so that was sort of a practice accessible product. I tried to put it down there because it was a professional book. On the other hand, we did a few articles, Sloan Management Review, organization dynamics. We started putting some of our diagnostic instruments and sharing those. We started talking about some of the results from the study in both theory and practice ways, so that the practitioner community could see what we were doing, but also the academic community. And these are a couple of journals that I think, back to a question that was in the chat box about places to go. I think Organization Dynamics is an interesting journal, right? They represent and respect kind of both California Management Review, Journal of Applied Behavioral Science. Are these the A journals of the world? No, but because they look at both practice and theory and try and balance those things, they become, I think, really interesting outlets for our work. So in this work, right, obviously there's the direct connection with Tom at Booz Allen and then eventually PwC, but you'll notice that there's two other professional organizations. In the upper right, Getz Partners is a management consulting firm in Germany. And when I was at the Neoma Business School in France, one of their partners was thinking about studying agility and reached out to me when I was at Neoma and said, can we sort of take this further? You've done the work in the Agility Factor, you've done that work in North America. Let's look at what's happening within the European Union and begin to understand, does agility look any different in the European Union? And so we did a set of studies with Getz Partners and resulted in a couple of monographs related specifically to the European Union and how agility sort of looks. Another professional organization that was part of this is down in the lower right, the Corporate Research Forum in the UK. And it was through that connection, CRF, Gillian Pillins, Mike Haffenden run that organization. That's that sort of, yellowish picture there in the center of the slide. Gillian and Mike were part of the CEO network. And although CRF does their work mostly in Europe, we were connected. Sue's done work for them. Jerry Ledford's done work for them. A lot of the people at CEO, we've done cross research with each other. And so what I want to do from this is go into a sort of look at that study that we did with CRF. It was a very kind of specific piece of work. And so in the context of, so this, all of this stuff you see in front of you is, 10, 15 years of work. All right. And it started with a connection, it started with a social network, a relationship between Jim and the Center for Effective Organization and Tom Williams. And from that relationship, introductions to different parts, different universities, different companies, different consulting firms, different kinds of products, some that are more academic, some that are more professional. But that's been a big part of my life for the last 15 years or so, as I've tried to understand the phenomenon of organization change and define the notion of agility, operationalize it, integrate it with what we know about strategy and organization disciplines, and contribute to knowledge generation in a theory way and knowledge generation in a practice way as well. But I wanted to sort of take this one example, right, and talk about a specific study. And the way we're doing this is a storyboard. And one of the things that we did in the book was we tried to think about different ways to help people tell the story about the research that you did. And we actually pull from storytelling as a way of thinking about organizing your thoughts to tell an academic story in a practical and interesting way. And so the storyboard that we laid out for this particular study, so Jillian and Mike, said the members in our association at CRF are interested in agility too. Will you come and sort of do some work with us? And so Jillian and I in particular started to ask, what's the problem? And the problem was that in a world that's changing faster and faster, a lot of organizations are struggling to keep up. And there are a number of cautionary tales out there of organizations that who had become so devoted to the principles of efficiency and stability that they became fragile instead of agile. And that the notion that if you think about agility, here's a way out of this VUCA environment, and building some capabilities that would do that might answer some of the challenges that you're facing. All right, so that's how we framed the problem. The big idea was agility, and the agility pyramid came out of the book, the agility factor, and it helped people see that you don't just become agile, you have to have a foundation of good management. This became the jumping off point for the Sloan Management Review article. You have to be sure that you have systems and processes in place that are fit for purpose. And those fit for purpose processes allow you to have capabilities that differentiate you in the environment. And the routines of agility help you understand when and how to change those capabilities. So the big idea there became the notion of agility. This is the answer to the problem. And let's go out into the organization and begin to understand, using some of the surveys and interview questions that we had used in the agility factor. Let's go to the members of CRF and start to ask them questions. And in this particular case, we going back to the sweet spot, right? You want methods that are both rigorous and relevant, right? And in traditional research, right, you want to have a dependent variable that's measured independently of the independent variable. Well, in this case, we relaxed that. We simply asked the people, a set of questions about their own agility, but we also asked them about their own perception of their performance. And so we had a common method variance problem that academics would look at and go, that's a weakness in what you got going on there. Fair enough. From a credibility point of view, asking people, their own perceptions of their performance, and showing them that in their minds, the more agile they were, the more the higher their levels of performance, was a credible way of connecting those two things. So was it perfectly rigorous? No, we had to relax some things. Was it practically relevant, but credible? Absolutely. And so we could tell this story eventually now to our target audience. Most of the people inside of CRF hail from a human resource function, but the notion that came out of this was not only do our organizational processes and management processes have to be fit for purpose, but they need to be more than that. So you have to be good like everybody else, and you have to be different so that you can change. And we now get into sort of this notion of how do we build these systems inside of organizations so that they're fit for purpose and they're flexible and appropriately fast enough to change as fast as the environment is going. So through the research, pulling from the stuff that we had done before, we were able to come up with this notion of a storyboard, and the storyboard guided how we wrote the monograph that was distributed to all the members of CRF. And so we just thought it was an interesting tool that we would share with this group as a way to organize the way you communicate your results to a practitioner audience. All right. And with that, I think, Phil, I'm going to turn it back to you. Yes? Yep.
Okay, a couple of questions came up, Chris.
Okay,
I thought we could take. One is you worked with the Getz partners and PwC and so on. Now, I have done that too. At first, reluctantly. We one of our interviewees was Bob Sutton, and he said, I'm not going to associate with those salespeople. And then he started hanging out at IDEO, and we got some relationships there, and they were doing practical work for companies, and sort of got hooked by that whole notion and so on. And I had some experiences working with McKinsey, and it was kind of, oh, do I have to put on a tie and this and that? No, and I'll tell you, it opened up to all sorts of avenues of conversation and dissemination of knowledge. Do you have any perspective, Chris and Sue, as well, about sort of how to connect to a consulting firm, or how to connect to an organizational practitioner who's curious and might be interested in some research?
I'll talk about the consulting piece, right? If the big consulting organizations, Getz Partners is a pretty good size. It's not a McKinsey size, but it's a good size consulting practice firm in Europe. And as I've thought about the relationships that I've had with different ones, there is an interest on the consulting side, right? What they have is all this data and experience. And a lot of times they have PhDs and researchers and stuff, but they are really very much associated. But there's an interest, there's a motivation to sort of link back. So even as you're getting connected to those, how do you do that? I think it's conferences. That's in my mind, the single biggest, best way to connect with the consultants is go to the practitioner conferences, because they're always there. And if you're presenting your stuff, the consultants often come up and want to talk to you. The second thing is just use your network. I think the knowledge generating network diagram is important, because you have to cultivate relationships, right? It wasn't Sarah, it wasn't, what's the word I want? I didn't go, serendipity is part of it, but I had put myself, this sounds a little strange, I'd put myself in the center, and at the Center for Effective Organization. And because I had put myself in the center, I was connected to Sue and Ed and Jim and Jerry and Jay Galbraith and all those people. and you have to use your network.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I'll say about it, back to the questions of I'll never work with those, you do have to mind your boundaries. You have to be really clear about who owns the data, where does the data come from, and you want to be really clear about your contracting in those relationships there. We were fortunate with Tom Williams. He'd worked with the center before, he'd worked with Jim before, and so we had a bit of a template to work from. But you do have to mind those boundaries and recognize that everybody's bringing different pieces to the puzzle. Sue, you want to add anything to that?
I would just reinforce the notion of conferences, talking to people. I think in today's world, it's going to be easier because of the ease with which people can communicate with each other through social media, email, etc. I remember one study that I was part of or led, which was the US government was setting up 5 nanoscience research centers from scratch around the country at other research institutions, government research institutes, and they wanted to figure out how to design it. And it just so happened that I had given a presentation to an aerospace and defense audience that was taped, and that the head of the bureau that was setting up these institutions saw. And he started communication with me. It took 2.5 years till we got to the study, but it was fascinating 2.5 years. The issues were really, really very interesting. And I knew that at the end of it, whether or not there was a formal study, that I was going to have a huge amount of understanding of the issues of doing advanced science in an institutional setting that is really a global network in disguise. And that was going to be foundational to my next 10 years of research. And so I invested a lot of time with a fellow who turned out to be a remarkable theoretician in and of his own right. And we had about an 8 to 10 year partnership.
Yeah,
Good story.
yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I've had, I think one of the takeaways here should be very clear that Sue uses the term both in an academic sense and in an operational sense. It's a relational process. You really do have to put yourself out there, and a great way to do it is to attend these industry conferences, but also there can be interesting hybrids. Peter Senge created a group called the Society for Organizational Learning. Ed Shine was there and some others. And practitioners who are interested in this stuff gathered together with academics. And I must say, I found myself taking more notes from those meetings than I did at the Academy of Management sessions. This is an interesting stuff. The practitioners, they're very smart. They have a different way of looking at the world in many instances. But the more you can understand what the world looks like from their perspective, learn to tune into their language and way of framing problems, you'll find your own mind starts sparking and making some connections both to the theoretical side as well as that'd be an interesting thing to study. I wonder how I would do that, and so on. The second one for me is there is a bit of selling in this, which sounds sort of unclean in some fashion. But part of your work is, if you really want to engage practice, is to convince people that it's worth doing a study. So to close, we have 12 guidelines. So these are very small print. We'll make sure you get this, an infographic put together. A couple of points that I wanted to note about this is, one, this is not what you learned in your methods courses. Your methods course is in there, but it's embedded in these ideas to engage and link to the world of practice. And 3 of them that are key to me is to start with a practical problem. I know that you do want to do a close reading of the literature, find a hole, et cetera, but then the important question is, well, who cares about what this hole looks like, and what does it look like in the practical world? How would it translate into a network of interest, or how would it translate into a problem of an organization trying to adapt to challenges associated with Me Too or Black Lives Matter, or something that is really top of mind for practitioners? And it's that interweaving of the theory and practice that's critical. But I always start with a practical problem. The second one is to be bilingual. I find it difficult to read some of the articles in the academic journals at this point. They are so filled of their own particular arcane language and so on, and implications for practice. Do some training. Oh, that's a great implication. No one has ever thought of that. I mean, actually drill down in there to understand what it would mean practically for a manager to do this and explain it using their language. The third one is to use multiple methods. I think I really learned from my association with Sue and later Chris to start out to just get your arms into the problem you're studying. And see what it feels like, looks like, what it smells like, as Sumatra Gasol always used to put it. And then sort of put some theoretical architecture and bricolage around it. And the last thing we leave you with is it's good to talk to managers, in a conversational way and say, do this, do that. But if you can give them a tool or a framework or an instrument or something like that they could say, yeah, let me work and think about this thing and see what it looks like in my world. Then you have a real opportunity to share your theoretical and academic perspective and let a practitioner kind of play with that and work with it. And there's nothing better in my mind than a model like the agility pyramid or a survey instrument and so on that not only makes your knowledge actionable, it also helps to build your own reputation and capacities to sell your next research project. So last slide, Chris. Last two. Yeah, this is our first one. In number 2 and number 3, we're going to get into some more storytelling with some of the people we interviewed. John Bordeaux is going to join Sue and Chris in the second one and share his perspective. He's got an interesting career in and out of academe. And the third one, we'll talk about some of the operational and ethical issues that come up in these things. And, Chris was very clear. You got to worry about intellectual property when it comes to working with consultants and so on. You also must be aware that in this practical knowledge can be used in lots of ways. I live in New Mexico, and we're still having seminars from groups that were used as subjects for radiation testing in the atomic bomb. And I don't want to overstate the import of your findings but and knowledge, but it can be misused in various ways to break a union, to exploit different interests and groups and so on. So how do you sort of center yourself in this space? And those are the kinds of issues we'll cover in session 2 and 3. And as a final one, understand we're doing a little selling today. The book is available at a nice discount, and we'll send you this material. We obviously urge you to buy it and read it, but also to share the materials we're presenting here. Join in a network. Garima Sharma of the Network for Business Sustainability has a whole association of young faculty and young practitioners sharing ideas on doing collaborative research to get yourself out there and socialize with fellow travelers. So that's good on my end. Last thoughts, Sue, Chris?
That's it.
That's the formal piece. I put a note in the box that that was the formal piece, but we'd be happy to stay on a little while and answer questions if people want to raise their hand. In fact, there it is. Irana, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you for a presentation. We're here together with my husband doing research in different fields. So he has a question.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. And I would like to address my question to Chris. It looks that the diagram of the knowledge generating network is almost ideal to describe the situation we recently had with the recently formed working group. in the framework of Canadian Wildfire Research Network. And the main focus was generating of the knowledge and addressing this knowledge correspondingly to the practitioner needs on the ground. And my question is regarding this diagram. From your experience, would the diagram be applicable to, in general, model to any type of the research network, or it should be adjusted and transformed depending on the what kind of the research network you are working with? Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I think the network, and I'll also ask Sue to chime in on this question too. The network diagram, the knowledge generating network there, I think that does represent a look across a bunch of different networks. And so it's maybe a bit abstracted. So to your point, I do think it's going to look it could look very different depending on the network. It may be more heavily weighted with academics than practitioners. It could be the other way. It could be an equal mix. That network could be quite diffuse in terms of the number of people involved. And there's a small set of people who sort of control the network as a center, as a hub within that network. Certainly the outputs of the network, whether they go into theory-based journals or practice-based journals or texts or cases, I think there's a lot of different ways that the network could flex. So I would start from that diagram and then looking at the specific nature of the work that you're doing, make some adjustments. Sue, would you add anything to that?
I would just say that I agree with you completely in slightly different words. The network really is a conceptual value stream flow from how does knowledge get created and then how does it flow to the consumers of that knowledge who can use it to accomplish their purposes. But the really important thing about it is it's a very connected network. So you could see on the left side of that, one research network that I was a part of was in healthcare, and it was a number of healthcare systems and chemistry companies and plastics companies coming together to try to solve a problem with the Department of Energy and the European equivalent. The issue of how to make recyclable devices for healthcare, because healthcare is one of the most polluting systems in the world. And it was chemists, it was biologists, it was physicians, people who worked in operating rooms, a big group of people. And then there was a subset of researchers in technical fields and organizational fields, et cetera, trying to solve the problem of how would you get the investment necessary to actually create new recyclable plastics and make them usable to people. That's a very big systems change. And the circle on the left was a set of people representing customers, representing patients, representing cities that were tired of being polluted, et cetera, coming together to really look at that issue. But then once that they did that study, there was a whole slug of stuff that would have to happen to help the plastics companies learn how to do this, to help recyclers know how to recycle things, et cetera. And there was going to have to be a large number of in the middle people on that picture who were creating usable outputs from the research that was being done. All the way ultimately to the healthcare systems that were the purchasers of a very different kind of devices and the physicians who had to incorporate that into their practices. So think of it as a flow, a conceptual flow, and populate it as necessary to look at what you're looking at.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thanks.
Other questions?
Perhaps I could ask a question whilst others might be thinking through a question. You, in a way, I suppose, address some of the aspects of the question I want to pose, but perhaps you could elaborate as well. I mean, for many of us keen to do what you call the sweet spot research, there might be an aspiration there, but we don't necessarily have the program in the PhD program that supports to develop that. Do you have any tips on, that you could give perhaps to doctoral students keen to develop sweet spot research, what they could do, and perhaps, think about some of the potential traps to avoid?
Well, I mean, I think the flippant answer is do it. It is make the contacts, reach out, try to establish connections, try to build a small group of folk who are interested in doing this kind of research, and some of whom have connections, and start small and learn how to do it. Some of the people who we write about in our book specifically sought out one or more mentors who had great connections to practice and were doing things highly relevant in the field. And essentially, either it was a match quickly made or a match that required some selling, but got involved with those folk and started to create the capacity to do this kind of work in the field by working with senior mentors. Some of them even chose their doctoral program or switched their doctoral program in one place based on the fact that they weren't getting that kind of support where they were, but they had potential mentors in a different doctoral program that was moving that direction. They were very tenacious about it. One of my first forays into the field of practice was with two other doctoral students I met at the Academy of Management, one of whom happened to be doing, interestingly, another study with the Forest Service. And the three of us had a couple meetings with the Forest Service in looking at what their organizational issues were with the highly dispersed set of people that they managed, and the fact that crises appeared and people had to converge in short periods of time. And at that point in time, the three of us were pretty standardly trained in academic research, but you sit around the table with the Forest Service folk, and your standard training immediately requires the translation into what's the connection here to practice. And so you can start very small. And you, one of the doctoral students at USC actually started with a not-for-profit NGO that she worked with, and she just volunteered her time to become part of a change process they were undergoing, and learned in that setting how to do it, and developed a lot of through her writing a lot of credibility in doing that kind of work. So it's really an entrepreneurial process.
I think one of the things I would also, Sue, you triggered in my mind a memory was working with your fellow graduate students. I mean, I did my dissertation with two other graduate students. Our lead professor and thesis advisor sort of said, "Okay, go." And we came when we had problems or issues that we would bring them to the professor. But it was really a sort of an entrepreneurial activity. And this was done in a commercial organization, but I have over the years found that nonprofits, NGOs of all types, human service organizations, they're hungry for research, and often more interested in the theoretical side of things than a manager would be, but partly as a function of their training and professionalism in a human service discipline or a social service discipline, and so on. So that what you need is is to get out there, but also to go out there with some friends. And you can find that there's various ways to split up the studies, so you could each make a unique and distinctive contribution. But there's a certain power and pleasure in working with fellow travelers as you're all trying to figure out how to get along.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Do you have any observations, perhaps from the chat? I noticed you've been actively responding to questions and comments, but for those who haven't been watching what's happening in chat, do you have any sort of ideas that you want to respond to?
Well, what I noticed is if you look at the last names up here, you see we have the world attending. And, the studies we have presented today have been tended to be companies in the commercial space located in North America and Europe. At least in my experience, there's great interest and appetite around the world. And I know Chris and Sue have done work in Latin America. I've done some work in Africa and with the African Management Association taking shape, African Academy of Management, I should say. China, we did a research study back in 1985 with a professor, the university professors excited about doing research post Cultural Revolution. India is a hotbed of studies. I've worked with several NGOs there, etc. But and one of the interesting opportunities is to collaborate not only across disciplines, but across nationalities. And put together a research partner from the north if you're south or south if you're north, and so on. It's an opportunity to. Capitalism doesn't look the same around the world, and certainly organizational varieties are rich in different countries, and practices are quite different. Some of them can be exciting and inspirational. Some of them you may find difficult to digest.
And I would say,
go ahead, Sue.
just to build on what Phil said, is my sense is that now more than ever, there are a lot of opportunities out there to connect with a consortium of people, a collaboration of people that are really trying to deal with some of the really fundamental problems we face as humanity and the earth. And that listservs and places like that, don't be shy. You see something like that starting up, write to the person who's organizing it and say, could I be part of that? Here's what I would bring to the party. I would love to be able to learn from it and help create knowledge to solve these problems. They're everywhere, these new kind of consortia, and keep your ear to the ground.
Absolutely.
And they are, to your point, Phil, they are very often very cross-cultural.
Yeah, that was going to be my point. The cross-cultural overlay on all this is it sure adds another level of complexity.
Yeah, but also of energy and excitement. For sure. Well, thank you all for coming, I must say, and I hope to see you in session 2 and session 3.